Well, having created and tested a model, you can publish it as a predictive experiment and then deploy it as a web service. So here I am in Azure Machine Learning Studio, and I have the diabetes classification experiment that we saw previously. So I've run the experiment, I've tested it, and if you remember, I'm getting a pretty good ROC curve at the end of this that tells me it's predicting pretty well as a classifier whether a patient is likely to have diabetes or not. So what I want to do is I want to publish this as a web service that I can then consume from a client applications. So to do that, first of all, I need to run the experiment, which I've already done. You can see that I've got the little ticks there that have been run. So now I can set up a web service. And the type of web service I'm going to set up here is a predictive web service. So we'll go and choose that. And what that's going to do is it's going to run off in the background. It's creating actually something called a predictive experiment. And you'll see it move some things around here. And then when it's done, I'll just close that little notification. And you can see I've actually now got two tabs. I've got my original training experiment, which was called diabetes. And I've now got this predictive experiment, which is called diabetes predictive X, but which isn't really particularly helpful. So I'm going to just change that to diabetes predictor so that I know what this thing is. Now, what's actually different about this experiment? Well, it's copied a lot of the modules from the other experiment across. You can't really see very clearly, so I'll just give us a little bit of room to work in and center everything and make sure that we can see what's going on. So we'll zoom in a bit and take a look. So we've got our input here, our diabetes input, and I've also got this web service input going on here. So you can see those are connected to the same place. And what we're saying is, look, when we run this as an experiment in Studio, we're going to use the data that's in diabetes CSV. But when I actually publish it as a web service, the input will come from the web service. The client application will send up the new data that tells me what I want to look at. Then we're going to join that to our doctor's data. We'll apply the same math operations we did previously. But then there's some other stuff going on here. Instead of having that normalized data module that we had, it's got this apply transformation, and it's encapsulated the normalization that I did in my experiment. In other words, it's going to apply the same statistical measurements of the data when it normalizes any new data that comes in. So whatever the statistics of my test data are, or my training data rather, that's what's going to be used for any new data that comes in. And that makes sense because if you think about this, we might call this with brand new data that maybe only has one row of data, and trying to normalize that one row, trying to get all the values within the same scale doesn't really make sense, and so we'd get an error in that case. So what it's going to do is it's going to use the same statistics and apply the same normalization logic that it did when it trained the model. And it'll do that for both of my normalizations. We're then obviously not going to treat patient ID and physician as predictive features. And then we've got our trained model that we trained in our training experiment. So we don't need to retrain that. We're just going to go ahead and use the one that we trained when we trained the model. And that's what we're going to use to score our results. And then those results will be passed out as the output from the web service. So it's a little bit different from our original experiment. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to change here before I publish this as a web service. This web service input is what my client applications are going to have to provide as input. And it's based on what we've got in the diabetes CSV file. And if I just remind you of what's in that, it includes the diabetic label, whether or not the patient is diabetic. Now, that doesn't really make sense that a client application would already know if the patient is diabetic and then ask you to predict whether or not the patient is diabetic. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that data set. I don't want my input to be based on that. And instead, I want it to be based on a manual input that I'm going to define. I could just go and point to another file or something, but I'm just going to enter the data manually and say, this is what I want my input to look like. So we need to specify what that obviously looks like. So let's go and type that in. So it's going to be CSV, and it's going to have a header. And so we'll just go ahead and I've already got some text here, so we'll just paste it in. So I've got my my data there, and it's just got a few rows of sample data, and it doesn't include the diabetic column. If we go along the end, the last column is age, so we've got our data there that we want to just go and predict with. Now what that means is all the way through the rest of my experiment, if I have used that column, if I've referenced that column anywhere, I need to get rid of it. So I'm just going to go through and check and make sure we haven't used our diabetic column anywhere in any of the other locations. We've got patient ID but not diabetic, so we haven't referenced that, so we don't need to go and remove anything. But if I had, I would need to remove it from any modules that were using it. So we'll go ahead and run that just to see what it looks like with that test data, just to make sure everything works. And when it finishes, I've got little ticks all the way through. It seems to have worked. If I just view the output of that, this is what's going to be passed back to the client. Now, it's going to include things like the patient ID, the pregnancies, the plasma glucose. In other words, all the same fields that the client application passed in the first place, as well as the scored labels and scored probabilities. And scored labels and scored probabilities aren't really very meaningful output names. So I probably want to change what gets output and just return the information that the client actually cares about. And so to do that, I'm just going to add a SQL module here, apply SQL transformation module. And we'll take the output from our scored model and we'll add it to that. And then we'll make the output of the SQL be what we pass to the web service output. And then we'll just go and modify this SQL script. So we'll just go and replace this with some existing code that I have. And here's my code. I'm basically getting the patient ID and the physician. So I might be interested to know who's this patient's doctor. I might need to inform them that we want to test them further for diabetes. The scored labels, but we'll give that a different name. We'll call that diabetes prediction, and scored probabilities we'll just call probability. So we've saved those changes and we are ready to go and just run that experiment one more time just to make sure everything works. And if I take a look at what's going to get returned to the web service client now, I've got the patient ID, the physician, the diabetes prediction, a 1 or a 0, and then the probability for that. So you can see that we've built out our experiment to train their model. We've then published that as a predictive experiment, and I've made a few changes to the predictive experiment just to affect the way that it's going to be published for our clients. So now I'm ready to deploy this as a web service, and I actually have a couple of choices. There's what we call a classic web service, which is compatible with the standalone version of Azure Machine Learning. But we've also got this new web service. I'm going to deploy using that. We'll just allow the pop-up. And it's going to deploy this as a web service and give it a name. Now, the name it generates is not very friendly, so I'm just going to call it Diabetes Predictor without a space. It's going to store this web service in my storage account, and I need to associate it with a pricing plan so that we know how to charge for the calls that get made. And I've got my plan that I deployed when I provisioned my workspace. So we'll go ahead and deploy that experiment as a web service. And when it's deployed, I get this web services website opening up where I can manage all of my web services that I've deployed. And I'm in my Diabetes Predictor website. And I can get information from here about the number of requests. Obviously, there haven't been any yet. And I can do things like configure it and test it. So there's a number of options here for me working with this. Later on, we're going to come back and look at how we consume this web service.